Next, we have up Mike Dane. He ran into an interesting recursive problem in one of his projects that he's going to share how he solved it, how he worked through it today.
All right, so like you said, my name is Mike Dane, and I want to talk about recursive components in React. So this is a little problem that I ran into on one of my clients. So I want to talk a little bit about how we solved this problem, and we use recursion to do that. So what is recursion? Well, recursion is a method of solving a problem where the solution depends on solutions to smaller instances of the same problem. So one image that I always like to conjure up is Russian nesting dolls. So the idea is you have this large nesting doll, and then there's smaller, identical nesting dolls that are kind of nested inside of it. And to me, that's a good analogy for recursion. So we can have recursive functions in React, and this is an example of a factorial function. So in any recursive function, you have a base case, which is essentially just the bottom layer of the recursion. So it's where the recursion stops. You return an actual value. And then you also have the recursive call, which is where you call the function. So the function calls itself. In the case of factorial, you'd return n times factorial of n minus 1. So just like we can have recursive functions, we can also have recursive React components. And so a recursive React component is a React component which renders itself. And so a component in React is either rendered or it renders other components. And so in the sense of recursion, it would render itself. So here's an example of a recursive component. And in React, a component can actually just be a function. So in this case, we have this function, my component. It takes in some properties. And then down here, we're returning some JSX, which is kind of like JavaScript HTML. And so you can see down here, we have a base case. And then we also, inside of this base case, if this is true, then we're rendering that component. And if it's not true, then we won't render it at all. So that's where the recursion would stop. So when would you use something like this? Well, the situation that I ran into was rendering arbitrarily nested data. So we were tasked with building a component that looks similar to this. Basically, the idea was that this would be used for menus. So for example, if you were ordering a pizza, maybe you'd want different toppings on the pizza. You'd want chicken, so you might click the chicken box, and then there might be sub options. So the chicken could be buffalo chicken, it could be barbecue chicken. If you click buffalo, you might be able to choose from mild or hot, and then you could basically just keep choosing these different options, and these could be arbitrarily nested. And so this is kind of what the data structure might look like for that. You can see we have the name, which is chicken. It has an ID, which uniquely identifies it. It could also have some sub options. And then so inside of the sub options, you might have a structure that looks like this. So we have like chicken ID, sub options, and then within there, we have a list of identical structures. So you can see that these structures can just get nested, but they all look the same. So the chicken structure looks the same as the buffalo structure, looks the same as the mild structure. It's just like those Russian nesting dolls. But this is the type of data that we might need to use. So there's some unique challenges when you're dealing with data like this, and specifically if you're dealing with recursive React components. The first is managing the component state. When the component is rendering itself, how do you deal with keeping track of the state, keeping track of what's going on in the application? Similarly, how do you notify a parent element of changes to children? So if I'm one of those checkboxes deeply down in the recursive tree, how do I notify maybe a top-level component that something has changed? Similarly, you might have some problems with keeping styling consistent because the component just kind of renders itself a bunch of times, so the styling might get a little bit weird. So I'm going to show you guys an example, and this is very similar to the app that I built on the client, although it's simplified a little bit. So here we have the actual app, and you can see it's just this kind of menu selector. So I could come in here, I could select like pepperoni, and then there's some sub options. Maybe I want spicy. I could select chicken. Maybe I want buffalo, hot, and jalapeno hot. So you can see how this structure kind of works. It kind of works that way where you can select these different options, etc. So what I'd like to do is just show you the code. We're going to look a little bit at the code. More so, I want to kind of show you how, if I check this checkbox right here, how does that get passed up the recursive chain, and then how does that get stored inside of the state of the application? So if you don't understand all the code over here that I'm going to show you, not a big deal. I'm more just interested in kind of giving some of the main concepts. So in this application, we have actually 3 different components, and then we have the data structure. So up here, this is maybe data that you'd get from the server, and this is that structure that we looked at before in the slides. Now over here, we have our app component. Now this is the main component. This is the kind of the root level component that gets rendered. And this is the component that's going to kick off rendering the recursive component. And so inside of here, we have this state object. And this component is going to manage the entire state of the application. So it will manage all of this as we kind of go through. And we can take a look at what the state actually looks like. So over here, you'll see I have this state object. So this is what the state looks like for this entire application. You can see here, like if chicken is selected, then we have the chicken ID here in this structure. And then buffalo is selected underneath that. So inside of this object, we have the buffalo ID. And then inside of there, hot is selected. So inside of this structure, we have the hot ID, et cetera. So hopefully you can kind of get an idea of how this data structure is structured. Now, the reason I'm using a structure like this is because since we're recursively rendering this, we need a structure that can dynamically grow in size and that can be dynamically nested, just like those Russian nesting dolls. And so over here, in this top level app component, we have all of our state. And then what this is going to do is it's going to render this options list component. Now, this is our recursive component. So this is going to pass in all that data that we got from the server, those topping options. It's going to pass in an onChange function, which essentially all that's going to do is it's just going to receive some updated options. Whenever I check one of these, basically that information will get propagated up the recursive chain, and then we'll store that in the state. And then we'll basically pass that state back in this selected options prop. So that's a little bit about how this works. Again, if it doesn't fully make sense, it's okay. I just want to kind of bring out these main points. So here is our recursive component. This is the options list. And you'll see here, this is structured very similar to that recursive component I showed you in the slides. Here we have our return function. And in here, I'm basically just mapping through all those options that we got from the server. And for each one, I'm creating a checkbox. And then down here, we have our base case. So this is where we're going to decide whether or not we want to recursively render this component again. And in this case, we're going to render it again if it has sub options. So if there's, for example, buffalo has these sub options down here, that's when we would want to render it. And also, we only want to do that if it's selected. So if it's not selected, we don't want to render the sub options. Now in here, I'm just passing those sub options, and then I'm passing from this structure, I'm passing any of the data that's nested inside. So there's two things that I want to point out here, and then we'll kind of follow what happens when I click one of these. There's two functions that I have declared in here. We have the handle checkbox clicked function, and that gets called whenever a checkbox gets clicked. Pretty simple. We also have the handle sub options list change function, and this is where it gets a little tricky. This function is declared inside of the options list. And anytime we recursively render the options list, like we do down here, we pass that in as the onChange function. So whenever one of these sub options list changes, this function is going to get called. Now, this is only going to get called if it's a sub options list, if it's an options list that gets rendered recursively. In the case up here in the root component, when we first use this options list, instead we pass it this onChange function, which just updates the state. So again, I don't want to get too bogged down in the code here, but what I'd like to do is open these two functions up. I'm going to go ahead and click this checkbox, and then we'll actually see what happens as the information that this checkbox got clicked gets passed all the way up through this recursive chain, and then the state gets modified and then passed back down. So when I click the checkbox, the new state kind of builds up. It gets handled here in this app component, and then it gets passed back down and we'll re-render everything. So let's click Cayenne and we'll see what happens. So I'm going to click this little debug option, click this, and now you'll see that we're getting an alert. So this is going to tell us exactly what happened. And actually, real quick, let me redo this so we can see the code. Okay. So real quick. All right, so we'll click Cayenne. And now you'll see here, it says that the handle checkbox clicked function got called. So that's this function down here. That gets called when a checkbox gets clicked. So it says we click the Cayenne ID checkbox. Cayenne ID is not currently selected. To select it, we'll add Cayenne ID to the current selected option structure. So essentially the structure that we had at this point, and remember, we're just down here in this bottom, all the way down the recursive chain. We had the jalapeno ID already in there. That's why jalapeno was checked. Now we're going to add Cayenne ID into that structure, and then we'll call the current option list's onChange function with the updated selected options structure. So now I'm going to click OK. And what's going to happen is the onChange function that got passed into this sub options list is going to get called. It's a little bit confusing, but let's see what happens. So I'll click OK. You'll see here it says handle sub options list change was called. So this function down here, down at the bottom of the screen there, got called. That's what got passed in. It says the onChange function of hot ID was just called with the following sub options. So hot ID is right here. It's this checkbox. That onChange function got called with these options. So basically we're telling the parent component like, hey, this is what the state should look like now. We're not updating the state. We're just saying this is what it should look like since the user checked the checkbox. So now we'll set the hot ID in this structure equal to this entire thing, and we'll pass that entire structure up to the next parent. So here you can see now we have, this is kind of the state that we have right now, hot ID, and then inside of there we have the two options that are checked. So now we have this structure, and we're going to pass that up to the next parent, and I'll click OK. You'll see here it says handle sub options list change was called. The onChange function of Buffalo ID was just called with the following sub option. So Buffalo ID, now we're at that next level. We're at the level above that, and we got this data structure which we just created. We saw how that happened, and now we're going to set Buffalo ID equal to that and pass that entire structure up to the parent. So now we have this as our state. So as you can see, as we go up this recursive chain, we pass up this data. This structure gets created incrementally. And this is just like Russian nesting dolls, right? We start here at the bottom in this jalapeno cayenne list with the smallest doll. And then we embed that into the next biggest one. And then we embed that into the next biggest one, et cetera. That's essentially what we're doing here. So now if I click OK, now it says the onChange function of the chicken ID was just called with the following sub options. So now we're all the way up here at the top of this chain. It's been given these options. And now we're going to create this entire state. And then now, instead of passing this up into another sub options, this is going to get passed up into that root app component, the one that wasn't recursively rendered. And then we'll update the state. So I'm going to click OK. And you'll see here it says app component, setting selected options state to all of this. And so now we've essentially gone from the bottom, the bedrock of this recursive structure, and we've slowly built up the current state of the application, also that cayenne ID could show up right here because that's what we checked. Now we're in the app component. This is the component that manages all of the state. We're going to update the state, and then we'll re-render. And then when I click OK, you'll notice that cayenne right here should be checked. So I'm going to click OK, and then it passes that state all the way back down, and now it's checked. So there you go. Obviously, if that doesn't 100% make sense, it's because this code can get a little complicated. It's just the nature of recursion. But hopefully that gives you an idea of how something like this would come together, right? I think this is a great analogy of like Russian nesting dolls, right? Right here is the smallest Russian nesting doll, and we slowly build up that structure until we get to the root level component. So this is how we solved that problem in the client project that I worked on. It was a little more complex. Obviously, the data structures were a little bit different, but that's basically how it works. Hopefully that whets your appetite for recursive React components, and thanks for listening.
That was awesome, Mike. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Mike? I think there were some questions in the chat about your CodePen skills and how you were able to get the alerts and stuff.
The one thing that I guess I'll say I really liked about this as an example is a lot of times people will conflate like the data with the state. At least in like a CanJS app that happens a lot. They'll be like, okay, well, I got this nested structure, and I'm just going to put like little extra properties on it, whether it's checked or not. And those two things get cobbled together, and that's not a good idea. And this shows how you can keep those things separate, even in a recursive, data structure, which is really nice.
You know, on the client project, like all we really needed to keep track of were those IDs. So we didn't need any of the names or any of, all we needed was those IDs. And on the real structure that we use, there's, probably 10 different fields on each one of these objects. So it made sense to just have a more minimalist structure with those IDs.
Sweet. Any other questions or comments? No? Good. All right. We'll have the breakout rooms after this, and Mike will be in a React room, so you can ask him more questions or just nerd out about React.